All right, let's begin. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Very good to see such a great turnout today. I am Mugant, the Southeast Asia lead for the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project. I am the host of this series of webinars on good regulatory practices and medical device regulation. Before we begin, I would like to inform you that we have both English and Bahasa Indonesia interpretation for this webinar. You will see a little logo on the bottom right of your Zoom screen with the relevant options. One little quirk to point out, you will need to select the tab that says Japanese if you are seeking interpretation in Bahasa Indonesia. This is due to limitations of the Zoom platform itself. This webinar is being recorded. It is also being live streamed over the YouTube channel of the Center for Health Policy and Management of Gadjah Mada University. And for the benefit of all participants, a copy of the recording and presentations from today will be made available on the UGM website, and my colleagues will be sharing that address in the chat box right now. So welcome once again to the first of a two-part webinar on good regulatory practices, or GRPs, and medical device regulation. Now, we recognize the importance of GRPs as a benchmark for developing and implementing high-quality, cost-effective, and efficient regulatory oversight. And there are a few sectors where this is more essential and important than in the healthcare sector. There is a plethora of products, each with their own unique challenges in assessing quality, safety, efficacy, and maintaining standards in production and post-market surveillance. This current webinar is on global trends in good regulatory practice. We will cover topics such as the World Trade Organization's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, or WTO TBT agreement, specifically as it relates to GRPs, and international and regional guidance and frameworks to regulate medical devices. In particular, we are focused on the Indonesian government and industry experience, but this series is what I like to call foundational. It touches on general principles and guidance that are takeaways for other countries and stakeholders as well. The webinar series is part of the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project, or the MDRC. It is a US government-funded public-private partnership between USAID, the American National Standards Institute, in collaboration with the Advanced Medical Technology Association. The project's broad remit is to advance regulatory convergence with key global partners in partnership with standards developing organizations, as well as national and regional health and regulatory authorities. In Indonesia, we would not have been able to organize this webinar without the support of the Ministry of Health and Gadjah Mada University. So a big thank you to the teams from both ChemCAS and UGM for a great partnership, and we look forward to continuing this collaboration. I also want to thank the speakers in advance who have offered to contribute to this webinar. As you will see, it is quite late in the night or really early in the morning for some of them, so I really appreciate them being here today. Finally, some housekeeping. Most of you should already be muted, but if you're not, please ensure that you're muted unless you're presenting. We welcome questions and comments. Please drop them in the chat box at any time, and the moderators and panelists will address them where they can. And we do apologize in advance if we are unable to get to some of your questions. Now, I would like to begin by inviting Dr. Lucia, Rizka Andalucia. She's the Director General of Pharmaceutical Services and Medical Devices, Ministry of Health, Indonesia. She will be delivering the opening remarks. Could I check if Dr. Lucia is online, please?
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome, Dr. Lucia. Thank you for joining us.
I'm here. Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thanks to the organizing committee for the opportunity from MOH to join and collaboration with the organizing committee to conduct this 2 days seminar or webinar. Yeah. Yes, as we know, the medical devices are unique and different from other goods and consist of various types, technology and functions, and also the purpose of the medical device is very varied. Therefore, regulatory practice in the context of ensuring safety, efficacy, and quality is critical in addition to accessibility. through the resolution of WHA number 60.2 state that effective regulatory system is an essential component of healthcare system, strengthening and contribute to better health outcomes. As we know, during the pandemic situation, we have many experience how to develop the medical devices and also the in vitro diagnostic for the treatment and also diagnostic in the COVID-19 situation. Effective regulatory system must cover all stages in the life cycle of the medical devices production, starting from the research and development phase until to disposal of the medical device. Indonesia medical device regulation is based on regional and global practices. Indonesia is also active as a member and participant in medical device organization that adopt and complies with global standards such as AMDD, AHWP, APEC, and IMDRF. And also Indonesia has ratified the ASEAN Medical Device Directive in 2018. Through this ratification, Indonesia has implemented AMDD in the medical device regulatory system. Thus, the position of Indonesian medical device regulation is in line with the regulation of medical device in ASEAN. The regulation that have been harmonized by ASEAN are accordance with the regional and global standard, both from pre-market, post-market, standard chemical performance and safety, and quality management system. We hope that the acceptance of Indonesian local production of medical devices is easier to enter the abroad market to increase the competitiveness of Indonesian medical devices. Learning from the pandemic situation handling, Indonesia has also launched the health system resilience transformation. Improving the resilience in medical devices is one of the priorities of the Ministry of Health in the framework of the transformation of health resilience system, which includes several priority projects, including quality control of medical devices. We believe that the implementation and development of a good medical device regulatory system can support a better health system. Therefore, we are open to collaborate with stakeholders to create a better regulatory system for medical devices in Indonesia. Lastly, I hope that this two-session webinar will be successful as planned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lucia. I would now like to invite Professor Laksono Trisnantoro, the Special Advisor to Indonesia's Minister of Health for Resilience of Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Industries, to deliver remarks, please.
Thank you, Pak Mugant. Yeah. So I prefer to speak in Bahasa, Pak Mugant. It's okay because I think most of the participants are Indonesians. Okay. Yes. Can I share the screen, my screen? Terima kasih sekali. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Jadi pada pagi ini kita akan membahas sebuah hal yang menarik mengenai bagaimana regulasi untuk medical device. Nah tadi Ibu Dirjen, terima kasih Ibu Dirjen telah membuka acara hari ini, memberikan semacam pengantar yang menarik untuk betapa pentingnya regulasi ini. Jadi kalau kita lihat memang di dalam konteks alat kesehatan ini sebuah situasi yang menarik antara bagaimana kita itu bisa memproduksi, tapi juga ada satu konteks yang rumit ya dalam konteks proses dari pre-market sampai post-market dan regulasi global yang ketat karena ada beragam produk, kemudian tantangan sulit dalam menentukan ya nih menjamin keamanan, kemanjuran, efikasinya, dan juga mutu. Kemudian juga tadi produksi, distribusi, dan pengawasan yang tentunya bisa membahayakan pengguna kalau tidak diawasi dengan baik. Nah, tantangannya memang bagi Indonesia yang mempunyai model 4 kelompok ya, dari risiko rendah sampai tinggi, ini bisa memenuhi standar internasional dan kewajiban hukum dari Organisasi Bidang Dunia WTO yang kita ikut jadi bagian aktif dari sistem global ini. Jadi ini tantangan yang menarik untuk kita lampaui atau kita hadapi. Nah, inilah yang menjadi isu kunci ketika saya sebagai staf khusus menteri dihubungi oleh timnya Pak Mugant ya dari COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project atau MDRC, dari USAID, dari ANSI, dan dari M.Pharm. Ini satu gabungan antara pemerintah dan swasta. Memang ini menarik karena kita bisa memajukan apa yang kita sebut sebagai dunia alkes kita ke tataran global. Ini. Nah, ini satu kesempatan emas yang perlu kita kembangkan, dan di sini saya mencoba untuk membawanya itu dalam suatu proses pembelajaran ya, dalam suatu model knowledge yang harus kita kembangkan. Nah ini, dan ini webinar yang 2 minggu ini, minggu pertama dan minggu depan nanti. Nah ini perlu sekali diikuti oleh pimpinan unit pemerintah yang bertanggung jawab atas pengawasan industri perangkat medis ini, juga pimpinan industri yang menghasilkan produk-produk yang tentunya harus comply pada aturan-aturan nasional dan internasional. Kemudian juga, nah ini yang jadi satu hal menarik, saya berharap juga ada suatu kelompok pakar ya, dan mungkin juga dosen-dosen di perguruan tinggi yang memang ahli dalam alat kesehatan. Ini sangat penting karena tanpa ada kelompok pakar yang nanti juga akan menjadi bagian dari sistem uji atau panel atau clinical trial untuk untuk alkes berisiko tinggi, ini perlu kita wadai dalam satu masyarakat yang dinamis dalam konteks pengetahuannya. Juga tentunya pimpinan rumah sakit. Nah, jadi banyak pihak yang sangat terkait dengan program ini, dan harapannya juga akan diikuti oleh pelatihan-pelatihan yang lebih detail dan operasional. And I think Pak Mugant, USAID will also organize some training for MOH and also for other professions in medical device industry. Ya. Kemudian juga materi ini akan disimpan dan dapat diakses kembali dengan mudah di website di industriobatalkes.net yang nanti akan diumumkan terus oleh panitia. Oke, saya kira ini sebagai pengantar dari saya, dan saya akan ikuti sampai selesai, dan nanti juga akan ada persiapan untuk webinar minggu depan, dan tentunya akan ada program-program lanjutan yang akan meningkatkan pengetahuan dan keterampilan kita dalam regulasi medical device secara internasional. Selamat berdiskusi. Sekian dan terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Prof. And I do want to acknowledge Prof. Laksono's strong support for the project and valuable guidance as you continue to implement MDRC-related trainings and events for Indonesia. So thank you again, Prof. Next, we have Stephen Vibes, Vice President for Global Strategy and Analysis at AdvaMed and MDRC Project Lead, to outline the MDRC and its objectives that ultimately aims to build long-term resilience in the national health system. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Mugant, and a good morning to everyone. As Mugant mentioned, my name is Stephen Vibes, and I'm Vice President in the global team at the Advanced Medical Technology Association, AdvaMed, based in Washington, D.C. I am the project lead of the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project, which I will refer to as the MDRC. I first wish to extend my appreciation to the Indonesian Ministry of Health and also Gadjah Mada University for the opportunity to participate in this initial two-part webinar series. The MDRC is a public-private cooperative project under the Standards Alliance Phase 2 initiative of the U.S. Agency for International Development, working together with the American National Standards Institute, AdvaMed, and our many medical technology partner associations, including the Global Medical Technology Alliance. Prior to COVID-19, AdvaMed, ANSI, and USAID already worked together to promote foundational good regulatory practices and medical device regulatory convergence. We conducted this work for the general benefits of public health, focusing on removing specific instances and systemic barriers between patients and medical technologies. With the onset of the pandemic, this work took on a new urgency. USAID and ANSI approved of the MDRC as a project at the global level, spanning 3 regions of Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And the MDRC is comprised of a 2-tier architecture. On Tier 1, we focus on raising awareness and building capacities on foundational good regulatory practices, which affect the whole of how a government regulates across all sectors, not just for health and not just for medical technologies, but the coherent manner in which a government conducts its formal rulemaking. On Tier 2, we focus on medical device specific convergence of technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment measures with a view to improving the interoperability of health systems and streamlining the regulatory approvals processes for medical technologies. A core success element of the MDRC is the use of international standards. As will be discussed, the use of international standards is not only recommended by the World Health Organization, the Global Harmonization Working Party, and the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, but it is also a treaty-based obligation of the World Trade Organization Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. The MDRC shares information on GRP, on the use of international standards as a core GRP, and we do this as a starting point in our work on both tiers to level set and to be able to use a common vocabulary as we zero in on medical device specific regulatory frameworks and benchmarks. We look forward to leveraging this webinar series as a solid platform with which to develop specific MDRC work streams, and we look forward to engaging all of you in this process. With that, I wish you an informative and productive session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for outlining the project. Onward. Our first panel is on good regulatory practices and standards. Its objective is to orientate us to the idea of good regulatory practices and how these can contribute to practical implementation of the TBT agreement. We'll talk about what constitutes good regulatory practices and the TBT agreement as a form of GRPs, or good regulatory practices. At the same time, a key underlying principle of the MDRC as it works with partners to strengthen health systems is through the promotion of good regulatory practices. So we will discuss Indonesia's commitments to and implementation of the TBT agreement and BSN's role, including in promoting conformance to quality and standards in the medical device sector. I will be facilitating this panel. I'm joined by Renata Amaral, the MDRC lead for good regulatory practices, and Ibu Koni Segala, Director of System for Standards and Conformity Assessment Implementation, BSN Indonesia. We will have both Renata and Ibu Koni go through their presentations and touch on broad issues related to the topic before we get into Q&A and discussions. Renata, why don't we have you start, since you're covering 2 topics? The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mugant, and good morning, everyone in Indonesia. So, as Mugant mentioned, I'm going to talk about good regulatory practice in the first part of my presentation and technical barriers to trade in the second part. The idea of this presentation is to connect and link good regulatory practice issues with international trade issues. From our experience with this project, is not an obvious connection for most of regulators we talk to, private sector stakeholders we talk to. So for us, it's more and more important to make the links, to make them clear to the audience, and of course I'll be here for any questions you might have. Good regulatory practice, the term good regulatory practice, also I'm going to refer here as GRP. It speaks to the quality and consistency of the domestic rulemaking process. So it refers to the internal rulemaking process. It refers to the internal coordination and review process under which the whole of government works to ensure that rules and regulations are crafted in an open, transparent, and participatory manner, and that the outcomes are risk-based and grounded in the best available practice. I'm going to detail each one of the terms I'm talking about here, but the first idea that I would like you to have is that good regulatory practices are not about creating new regulations, new standards. It's about coordinating the internal process of good regulatory practices. That's the main idea. So three things to remember when we talk about good regulatory practice. They are not about more regulation or less regulation. They are about facilitating better regulatory outcomes in the internal process of the government. Political process, they make directional decisions, but GRPs, they create good regulatory practices. The idea is that they create a professional process to rule make that follows up a political course set in the process. They achieve this by adhering to a transparent and participatory rule-making process, so transparent and participatory, that allows for the participation of different stakeholders from government, from private sector, from academia, during the rule-making process, and to evidence-based decision-making. So good regulatory practices are an important precursor of regulatory cooperation. I'm going to mention here two terms that we use a lot, which is regulatory cooperation and coherence. Only quality regulatory outcomes avail themselves of regulatory cooperation opportunities. So what's cooperation and what's convergence? When we talk about good regulatory practices, cooperation, it refers to any interaction between regulators from different countries that results in some form of cooperation between the countries in terms of a regulation, with a view to increasing efficiency while achieving the desired regulatory outcomes. So we talk about cooperation, about exchange of information between different countries, regulators from different countries about a specific regulation or standard. And convergence is also a form of cooperation, of regulatory cooperation, but it's one step further. It's when different countries decide individually to modify their existing or proposed regulatory frameworks to bring them to a closer alignment. So it's not only cooperation, it's I'm bringing regulations of different countries to a closer alignment between themselves. This can take place throughout time, of course, but the moment of drawing up regulations in the respective countries is often independent of each other and difficult to synchronize. So convergence is not necessarily an easy process between countries, right? Because of timing, of internal processes. So it's not always easy. So good regulatory practice, what involves good regulatory practice when you hear this term? It involves issuing a regulatory forecast, have a national regulatory register, provide opportunity for public comment, publish evidence and conduct regulatory analysis, respond to stakeholder input, use quality data and sound science, employ risk-based approaches, conduct regulatory impact assessments, conduct pro-competitive analysis, access the international impact of regulation, use international standards as a basis for national regulation, so not creating new regulations, but using international standards where they already exist as a basis for national regulations, conduct ex post assessment of regulatory impacts, and establish a central regulatory coordination body. These are all check items that we should have in mind when we are talking about good regulatory practice in the internal regulatory process of our countries. So what's the summary of a regulatory life cycle? Is we identify the need and set objectives of a regulation, gather that data and stakeholder input, design a regulation, implement a regulation, and access regulatory impact of that regulation. So that's in sum is a regulatory life cycle of a regulation according to good regulatory practice and and the principles that we consider and I consider internationally as a basis for good regulatory practice. So the implementation of good regulatory practice is a significant step towards cooperation, and that the regulatory regulations being designed produce results that generate less cross-border rights. So we're starting here talking about cross-border. I'm going to talk about trade a little bit, because good regulatory practices have their direct impact on international trade, on trade flows of goods. And we're going to talk about that a little bit when I talk about technical barriers to trade and the connection with good regulatory practices. So good regulatory practices encompassing the use of regulatory impact assessments, stakeholder engagement, and ex-post evaluation are a critical tool in the hands of governments to ensure that regulation achieves its objectives. Over the past several years, attention has grown for the trade costs of regulatory divergence, right? When we have different certifications requirements, labeling requirements, for example, divergence on regulations that are causing, indeed, trade costs. I always like to say, and I guess I included a slide of that, but over time, tariffs and import tariffs are not the biggest problem we have in international trade. The biggest problem we have are non-tariff barriers to trade, are technical barriers to trade, which can be translated into regulatory divergence many times. So diverging regulation may increase the costs of trade goods and services across borders. I brought here just the OECD guidelines for good regulatory practices. They are guidelines of the organization of OECD that were published in 2012 and are still largely used by the international community. The recommendation from 2012, it highlights a number of principles and tools that can help policy makers develop, implement, and update regulations that promote their policy goals and the public interest. The recommendation recognizes the importance of international regulatory cooperation for regulatory quality and the relevance of the tools of regulatory policy, encompassing ex-ante regulatory impact assessment, a stakeholder engagement, and ex-post evaluation of a regulation, to base regulatory policy making on evidence, including the evaluation of the likely benefits of a regulation, the costs of a regulation, and effects of a regulation, that in the consideration of the voice of the regulated. A good example of a good regulatory practice chapter that we have recently is from the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement, the former NAFTA agreement. Why we use that chapter as an example for other agreements that not only the United States but other countries are negotiating. And chapter on good regulatory practices is something relatively new in trade agreements. So this USMCA GRP chapter, it has articles encompassing central regulatory coordination body, the necessity of existing a central regulatory coordination body, internal consultation, coordination and review, information quality, early planning, dedicated websites, use of plain language, transparent development of regulations, expert advisory groups, regulatory impact assessment, final publication, retrospective review, suggestions for improvement, information about regulatory processes, annual report, encouragement of regulatory compatibility and cooperation, committee on good regulatory practices, contact points, and dispute settlement. So those are all the articles that are present in the GRP chapter. Of course, it's a very comprehensive chapter on GRP. That's why it's, and modern as well, that's why it has been used for the negotiation of other trade agreements. And this is the goal, like everything that is here in the GRP chapter of the USMCA is like the goal, what we would like to have for every country that is reviewing their good regulatory practices. I set up a space here for Q&A, but I'm going to jump to the next slide because I understand that we're going to have Q&A at the end of the session. So let's talk a little bit about TBT, about technical barriers to trade and GRP. I have here an outline of the next slides very briefly. So we are going to talk a little bit about WTO, World Trade Organization, general rules, non-tariff trade barriers, coverage of the TBT agreement, main principles of the agreement, relevant provisions, and the e-ping system that we like very much to use and introduce that to you. So general rules of the World Trade Organization, and you're going to understand why I'm bringing this here. I'm going to connect everything with good regulatory practice, trade, and costs of regulatory divergence. The only international body dealing with rules of trade between nations is the WTO. 164 members. WTO agreements provide the legal ground rules for international trade, for international commerce. They bind governments to keep their trade policies within agreed limits, and they help trade flow as freely as possible. For example, by removing obstacles, providing confidence, transparency, and predictability to the multilateral trading system. What are non-tariff barriers to trade? Here are some examples of non-tariff barriers to trade, but basically everything that is not an import tariff could be considered a non-tariff barrier to trade. So technical measures, for example, standards, in standards, international taxes or charges, customs rules and procedures, quantitative, import restrictions, public procurement practices, subsidies and related government supports, investment restrictions or requirements, transport regulations or costs, and the list keeps going on because it's not an exhaustive list of non-tariff barriers to trade. Those are just some examples. As I mentioned before, over time, we are having less and less problems with tariffs, import tariffs, and more problems with non-tariff barriers to trade. I included here the year of 1947 because it was when the agreement on trade and tariffs, general agreement on trade and tariffs was established after the Second World War. And then we had the World Trade Organization established here in 1995 and then present. And over time, we are following import tariffs decreasing and more problems with regulations, certifications, labeling, and etc. Problems that we have and face a lot in the medical devices sector as well. So coverage of the TBT agreement, it covers all the non-tariff barriers to trade, the list that I just mentioned to you. So technical measures, internal charges, customs and procedures, etc. is the same list that I just mentioned two slides ago. The TBT agreement acts as an instrument to encourage members to use less trade restrictive approaches to meet regulatory objectives, harmonize through the use of relevant international standards, provide transparency, and avoid and resolve trade disputes related to standards matters. The agreement basically safeguards against the use of technical requirements as disguised restrictions on trade, the development of inefficient technical requirements and procedures. Mugant, I saw my time is over. Can I have 5 minutes more?
Yes, of course, Renata.
Okay, thank you. So the relevance of the World Trade Organization for good regulatory practice. So starting to connect the dots, right? Unnecessary regulatory differences can impose costs that prevent business from engaging in trade. The WTO plays an important role in supporting efforts to facilitate trade through regulatory cooperation among all its members, offering a multilateral platform for dialogue among governments on trade rules and throughout the full rulemaking cycle of a country. The disciplines of the TBT agreement, Technical Barriers Trade Agreement, can help contribute with effectiveness and efficiency of regulations through good regulatory practice. The agreement lays down specific legal disciplines which directly address the preparation, the adoption, and application of domestic regulations on goods. It doesn't include services. The TBT agreement provides a unique multilateral transparency framework for regulations affecting the trade in goods. The main principles of the TBT agreement is no discrimination, avoidance of unnecessary barriers to trade, harmonization through the use of international standards, guides, and recommendations, transparency, notifications, and inquiry points, concepts of equivalence of technical regulations, and mutual recognition of results of conformity assessment procedures. I guess that for regulators that are here with us today, there are a lot of terms here that are familiar, right? The TBT agreement, I would like to highlight three articles that are really important to us, three paragraphs actually of the same article, of Article 2 of the TBT agreement, that are really key for everything that we work with in the MDRC project as well. So Article 2.2, members shall ensure that technical regulations are not prepared, adopted, or applied with a view to or with the effect of creating unnecessary obstacles to international trade. Article 2.3, technical regulations shall not be maintained if the circumstances or objectives giving rise to their adoption no longer exist, or if the changed circumstances or objectives can be addressed in a less trade restrictive manner. And the final paragraph that we really keep an eye on is Article 2.4, where technical regulations are required and relevant, international standards exist, or their completion is imminent, members shall use them or the relevant parts of them as a basis for their technical regulations. So every time an international standard already exists, members should observe the existence of an international standard and use this specific standard or the specific international standards where they exist as a basis for their own technical regulations. So principles to develop international standards. The WTO Committee on TBT, on Technical Barriers to Trade, adopted a set of principles to which an organization engaged in the development of international standards must comply. All these principles have been captured in this document here. You're going to have access to the presentation, so you can just Google the document. Entitled Decision of the Committee on Principles for Development of International Standards, Guides, and Recommendations. Next, some definitions of the TBT agreement. What's a technical regulation? What's a standard? What's a conformity assessment? Technical regulation is a document that lays down product characteristics or their related process and production methods, including the applicable administrative provisions with which compliance is mandatory. Standard is also a document approved by a recognized body that provides for common and repeated use, rules, guidelines, and characteristics, which compliance is not mandatory. And conformity assessment is any procedure used directly or indirectly to determine the relevant requirements in technical regulations or standards are fulfilled. Major medical technology regulatory trade challenge. The TBT agreement not implemented with most. It's not implemented with most medical device regulators we work with. Most medical device regulators which staff drafting regulations are either not aware of the TBT agreement or not required to implement the agreement by the trade ministries. Most medical device regulators are not aware of the MDRF guidance documents and the hundreds of relevant medical device standards upon which they should be basing their regulations, ISO, IEC, etc. Most medical device regulators still opting to dedicate their limited public health resources towards developing their own country agency unique requirements, even those requirements standards already exist. And if there is awareness of the TBT agreement, implementation is ex post and not ex ante. So medical devices are improperly regulated as drugs in many countries as well. Almost done, 2 slides to go. So I just wanted to introduce you to the e-ping system for those that do not know. It's a system of the World Trade Organization that is accessible to everyone. So everyone can have an account in the e-ping system. It's an SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and TBT, technical barriers to trade measures notification alert system that is publicly available and self-subscribing device service, whereby subscribers are able to receive emails alerts regarding SPS and TBT notification. In addition, users can search notification of other members, of other WTO members, share notifications, upload additional information, and participate in discussions. The e-ping also offers an inquiry point management tool to facilitate. So all 164 inquiry points of WTO members should be listed there on e-ping, and it's easy to find information. And finally, this is the page of the e-ping system. I can leave the link in the chat for those who are interested, but you can register here. You can make your own account and search for notifications, either TBT, SPS, and also build some filters that the system can send you notifications from time to time, weekly or daily, depends on how you set up the system. These are some examples of how the page looks, and that's it, Mugan. I think I'm sorry for taking longer.
That is quite all right, Renata. Thank you very much. It was very enlightening, and thank you for providing the broad overview. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to let Ibu Connie deliver her presentation so we can bring Renata's presentation into the Indonesian context and have a better basis for a conversation right after. So Ibu Connie, would you like to proceed, please?
Thank you, Mugan. Please allow me to speak in Bahasa. It's possible because many of participants here Indonesian people. It's okay ya? Thank you.
Absolutely. We have translation.
Ya, thank you. Izin Pak Bu Dirjen dengan Pak Prof Laksono, kami dari Badan Standarisasi Nasional. Saya Koni Sagala. Mungkin baru pertama kali ketemu dengan Bu Dirjen, dengan Pak Prof Laksono juga, and Bu Renata juga, dan beberapa perwakilan dari Mugant Office ya, dari MDC ya. Tadi Bu Renata sudah menyampaikan secara internasional ya aturan mengenai GRP, kemudian juga mengenai TBT-nya sendiri. Nah, yang kita, please share our slide. Nah, ini sekarang yang kami sampaikan adalah karena memang BSN sebagai badan notifikasi dan inquiry point juga di TBT WTO. Jadi kita akan menyampaikan peran BSN di sini di dalam penerapan GRP, khususnya yang terkait dengan standar teknikal regulasi dan penilaian kesesuaian. BSN di dalam melakukan kegiatannya ini itu punya legalitas hukum. Next slide please. Legalitas hukumnya ada dari Undang-Undang 20, PP 34, dan aturan GRP dari internasional itu kita adopsi sebenarnya di PBSN kita juga, PBSN 7 dan PBSN 8 ini. Lanjut mungkin. Nah, ini peran dan fungsi BSN sebenarnya. BSN banyak yang mengira ya Bapak Ibu bahwa BSN itu adalah Badan Sertifikasi Nasional. Padahal sebenarnya BSN tidak punya kewenangan untuk melakukan kegiatan sertifikasi. BSN adalah badan yang ditunjuk oleh Presiden untuk menetapkan standar nasional Indonesia, dan di dalam keorganisasian ataupun kelembagaannya BSN memang ada satu unit yang menangani akreditasi lembaga-lembaga sertifikasi. Dalam hal ini namanya Lembaga Penilaian Kesesuaian. Nah, ini fungsi BSN memang selain tadi sebagai badan standar, kemudian juga lembaga yang melakukan akreditasi, dan juga ada untuk yang metrologi. Nah, ini BSN selalu berkoordinasi dengan kementerian-kementerian yang menangani sektor-sektor seperti yang ada di slide ini ya Bapak Ibu. Kita lihat semua sektor kalau urusannya dengan nanti notifikasi ke TBT WTO itu harus melalui regulasi-regulasi ya, itu harus melalui BSN karena BSN sebagai notification body dan inquiry point. Even juga kalau misalkan kita punya permasalahan di Indonesia, kita ingin tahu regulasi di negara lain seperti apa, apalagi kalau memang kita punya hambatan ekspor ya ke negara-negara tersebut, kita BSN bisa melakukan kontak ke inquiry ataupun notification body negara tersebut untuk minta klarifikasi ataupun penjelasan terkait regulasi mereka. Dan kita juga BSN ini di dalam forum internasional juga sebagai anggota ISO, IC, Codex, kemudian juga regional ada PASC, ada ACCSQ, dan untuk akreditasi itu kita juga di IAF, ILAK, APAK, itu juga kita anggota ininya. Kemudian juga untuk meteorologi ada BIPM dan APMP. Ini adalah peran dan fungsi BSN khususnya juga di nasional maupun di internasional. Lanjut mungkin. Nah, ini kalau di lembaga standar internasional memang Bapak Ibu mungkin dari Kementerian Kesehatan kita punya di ISO itu ya punya beberapa technical committee yang terkait dengan medical devices ini, dan kalau kita petakan peran BSN atau peran Indonesia ya, karena memang kontak personnya adalah BSN kalau di ISO itu yang kita menjadi P member masih sangat sedikit, jadi ada di TC 97 dan ada di IC itu TC 25. Kalau sebagai O member, observer member itu ada di 161 dan 43. Ini adalah masih keterlibatan kita ya di forum internasional di dalam perumusan standar internasional. Lanjut. Nah, ini yang tadi disampaikan mungkin dari Bu Renata tadi sudah menyampaikan secara aturan, ini kita adopsi ke level nasionalnya. Jadi kita punya PBSN 7 dan PBSN 8 yang mana memang PBSN 7 dan PBSN 8 ini juga sudah kita waktu kita menetapkannya itu sudah koordinasi dengan semua KL. Karena memang penetapan RPBSN ini tidak boleh hanya BSN yang menetapkan sendiri, kita harus kolaborasi ataupun minta masukan dari semua KL-KL. Ini adalah tahap-tahapannya hampir sama ya dengan yang disampaikan oleh Bu Renata, tapi intinya memang BSN sebagai notification body dan inquiry point ini akan menotifikasikan semua regulasi-regulasi baik dalam bentuk draft masih ya Bapak Ibu, karena kita punya program nasional regulasi tenis. Ini juga kita buat dalam website BSN. Nanti kalau sudah final setelah proses harmonisasi Kumham ya. Kalau kita kan biasanya kalau buat regulasi harus harmon ke Kumham. Itu kalau memang sudah fix secara nasional, kita akan notifikasikan ke TBT WTO. Dan nanti kalau misalnya ada perubahan-perubahan regulasi juga ini akan kita notifikasikan juga ke TBT WTO. Lanjut. Ini adalah contoh saja, ini beberapa, ini ya lanjut aja. Oh nggak bisa ya, lanjut yang listnya. Ini ya notification process sama Bapak Ibu, mungkin nanti secara detail di PBSN 7 dan 8 ada tahapannya. Lanjut mungkin. Nah ini kalau kita lihat sebenarnya tren notifikasi kita ke TBT, kita dibandingkan negara-negara lain Bapak Ibu memang sangat sedikit ya. Notifikasi kita kalau kita bandingkan saja misalnya dengan Afrika yang mungkin masih dalam proses perkembangan juga ya, itu sekarang ini juga notifikasinya makin banyak dibandingkan Indonesia. Kita masih kalah lah dengan negara-negara Afrika kalau kita lihat secara internasionalnya. Nah ini yang selalu kita coba kita encourage, karena memang sebenarnya banyak regulasi-regulasi yang kita punya, yang kita missing untuk menotifikasikannya ke TBT WTO. Apa sih yang harus kita notifikasikan ke TBT WTO? Intinya bukan hanya berbasis SNI sebenarnya Bapak Ibu. Memang selama ini kita selalu menotifikasikan sebelum-sebelumnya ya, kalau regulasinya berbasis SNI, ini kita notifikasi ke TBT WTO. Tapi sekarang kalau kita lihat trennya, rata-rata memang di isu yang dibahas di forum sidang TBT itu bukan hanya berbasis standar. Misalkan sekarang juga banyak ya di Kemenkes itu regulasi-regulasi, apalagi waktu kemarin COVID ya. Kalau ada efeknya terhadap produk mereka masuk ke dalam negara kita, kemudian juga ada terkait dengan pengujian, misalnya juga sertifikasi yang ada perubahan-perubahan ini, walaupun dia tidak berbasis SNI, itu sebenarnya harus kita notifikasikan juga ke TBT WTO. Yang kita notifikasikan, kalau kita lihat ya sebenarnya kalau ini kita bicara dari sisi Kementerian Kesehatan ya Bapak Ibu, itu memang ada satu masih yang ada terkait dengan fat sugar and set labeling untuk food product. Tapi sebenarnya ada beberapa regulasi yang kita juga sudah identifikasi yang memang kalau ini dampaknya terhadap transaksi dagang ya, dan mempersulit, ada merupakan hambatan ya terhadap ini mereka ekspor dari negara lain, itu harus kita notifikasikan ke TBT WTO. Jadi ini kalau kita lihat pada saat masa COVID ya, pandemi kemarin, Indonesia memang yang terkait dengan regulasi-regulasi yang kita notifikasikan pada saat COVID itu hanya ada beberapa yang terkait dengan misalnya kita tidak ada less stringent lah, tidak melakukan fortifikasi terhadap minyak goreng dan tepung terigu kita waktu itu ya. Nah ini hanya itu yang kita notifikasikan waktu itu ke TBT WTO. Padahal sebenarnya kalau kita lihat dari negara-negara lain, misalnya seperti Brazil, kita lihat itu yang terkait dengan prosedur-prosedur registrasi, sertifikasi alat-alat kesehatan, itu mereka notifikasikan juga sebenarnya ke TBT WTO. Mungkin kita punya ya, ada beberapa mungkin yang kita juga missing untuk menotifikasikannya ke TBT WTO. Lanjut mungkin. Next slide, please. Nah, ini contoh-contoh saja nih beberapa regulasi yang coba kita identifikasi. Nah, ini kalau kita lihat memang kita sebagai negara anggota TBT WTO memang harusnya waktu itu melakukan notifikasi ini, walaupun mungkin yang ada yang sudah lama-lama ya. Ini yang terbaru mungkin regulasi-regulasi terbaru yang ada memang kaitannya dengan tadi standar, regulasi teknis maupun penilaian kesesuaian. Penilaian kesesuaian dalam hari ini ada sertifikasi, inspeksi, registrasi, dan semacamnya. Itu memang harus kita notifikasikan ke TBT WTO. Lanjut mungkin. Nah ini yang untuk yang medical devices TBT notification ini dari contoh aja dari beberapa negara anggota WTO. Ini tadi seperti disampaikan ada Cina paling banyak, Brazil, Ekuador, kemudian juga ada dari Israel, USA. Nah untuk yang Indonesia memang kita waktu itu mungkin karena komunikasi kita juga ya dengan Kemenkes kali ya, harusnya memang kalau ada regulasi-regulasi terbaru yang ditelepon oleh Bapak Menteri Kesehatan itu yang terkait dengan standar, penyesuaian dan regulasi teknis itu harus kita notifikasi memang ke TBT WTO. Lanjut. Ini hanya gambaran saja Bapak Ibu, tadi kami sampaikan bahwa di salah satu unit di BSN itu ada unit akreditasi, dan ini adalah salah satu skema akreditasi yang dilakukan adalah misalnya contohnya untuk 13485 itu Medical Device Management System, tapi ada juga produk yang mana di produk ini memang kita untuk yang alat-alat kesehatan itu akreditasinya masih sangat minim karena memang sekarang ini masih regulator ya yang melakukan langsung pengakuan ataupun penunjukan lembaga-lembaga yang melakukan pengujian ataupun sertifikasi tidak melalui pihak ketiga ataupun maksudnya badan akreditasi yang ada di Indonesia. Mudah-mudahan kedepannya nanti ada semakin peningkatan lah untuk yang alat-alat kesehatan kalau memang nanti berdasarkan standar ataupun pengujian berdasarkan regulasi itu diakreditasi juga oleh Komite Akreditasi Nasional. Lanjut. Nah, ini yang kita sudah diakui secara internasional. Memang kalau tadi ada salah satu skema untuk 13485 Medical Devices Management System, ini belum masuk di dalam MLA kita. MLA dalam arti Bapak Ibu bahwa sertifikat yang kita terbitkan di Indonesia, kalau kita mau ekspor ke negara luar misalnya, itu bisa diterima oleh negara-negara penandatanganan MLA yang ada di forum regional maupun di internasional. Termasuk juga hasil-hasil tes lab-nya. Itu juga ini. Tapi memang harus kita sadari bahwa kita masih perlu banyak improvement ya, ataupun mungkin dukungan terhadap fasilitas dari lab-lab uji kita juga, karena memang masih banyak beberapa alat-alat kesehatan kita yang mungkin kemampuan lab-nya ataupun pengujiannya di Indonesia ini itu masih dalam proses pengembangan ataupun proses akreditasi. Itu saja mungkin yang bisa kami sampaikan. Sangat senang sekali nanti kalau ada pertanyaan-pertanyaan. Nanti di sini ada teman saya juga, ada Bu Arini, ada Bu Rizki, yang bisa membantu nanti setiap pertanyaan ataupun diskusi yang ada. Terima kasih, Mugant. Thanks, Mugant.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Ibu Connie. Okay, again, participants, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll pick them up. And I do have some points for discussion. And let's start with the basics. So, Renata, you had a slide on good regulatory practices, and I'm asking this, to satisfy my own curiosity. You had a slide about principles and the list of GRPs in one of your slides. And in practice, how many countries actually fulfill all of those criteria, all those principles? And what are the challenges that you have seen? That's one. And then I want to bring Ibu Connie into this conversation as well, because she too had a slide on the GRPs that Indonesia implements, right? And so I want to know, Ibu Connie, again, how many of these are more challenging, or are there any difficulties in actually implementing these in practice in the Indonesian context? So perhaps Renata can go first, and then Ibu Connie can come in to speak about Indonesia's experience.
Quite hard to answer how many countries, Mugant, but more and more we are following more countries paying more attention to GRPs. As I mentioned also during the presentation, countries are including GRP chapters in their trade agreements. So that's meaningful, because that was not useful a few years ago, not so long ago. Was not happening. It was not a sexy topic, right, for a trade agreement, but now more and more it is. I am Brazilian, but I'm based in Washington, so I guess I'm not biased, but I have to say that the United States is leading really the work on GRPs and pushing GRP chapters on every agreement they negotiate lately. So we have, for example, a GRP chapter between Brazil and the US that encompasses all those items, the USMCA as well, the chapter the US negotiated with Ecuador as well. It includes all those items. It doesn't mean that the countries have checked all the boxes. For example, Brazil does not have a central regulatory body, and we have we have countries in Europe also implementing more and more GRPs. It's very hard to say how many, but also I wanted to mention that APEC, for example, in Asia, led the movement on GRP to the medical devices sector as well. So that's something very meaningful, and we are working here in this region of the country at the Western Hemisphere, trying to mirror actually what APEC has done with good regulatory practice for the medical devices sector in this region of the world. So I think more and more we are going to see a push for this, because this is closely connected with technical barriers to trade. These are more sophisticated problems than import tariffs, for example, for trade, for international trade. So I think more and more we're going to have it, and we're going to have countries and governments pushing for GRP and for having and encompassing all the checklists that I showed you a few minutes ago. Did I answer everything?
Yes, yes, thank you. And Ibu Connie, would you like to share about Indonesia's experience?
I
with
cannot hear.
implementing?
Yeah,
Would you share
Mugant,
about
please.
Indonesia's experience in implementing the GRPs and any issues that you find or challenges that make it harder to implement?
Okay, thank you, Mugant. As we a coordinator, yeah, to facilitate the technical regulation in Indonesia. So our challenge is actually when we have technical regulation could be established quickly. So sometimes the problem is we forgot to notify these technical regulations, and this is actually always raised in TBT, and Indonesia always faces this. But BSN also encourage our minister or department institution who make the regulations. So especially for transparency, yeah. For transparency, this is actually very challenging for us. Maybe we in the future we could make improve for this. And as Ms. Renata had mentioned before about the aping, actually, Ms. Renata, in Indonesia we have utilize this aping, but until now the member from Indonesia for this application, in my opinion, still not sufficient. We must improve the number of the member of aping in Indonesian level. And just for your information, in Indonesia we have like committee too, 3 times a year to conduct the meeting, and from this committee, every technical regulation from Indonesia or every barrier that we face it from regulation from another country, we discuss in this committee. And this committee actually the member consists of all of minister, include the association or producer. I think that is from us. Mugant.
Yes, I think we had a question from Viguna in the chat as well, also about missing TBT notifications and the implications of that. Renata, if you want to speak to that. I think Ibu Connie actually answered part of the question already for Pak Wira about the challenges and how sometimes there might be notifications that are not reported to the WTO.
Okay.
Connie, would you like to comment?
Maybe Renata first. Yeah,
okay.
Please.
Okay. So what's if I understood correctly, Mugan, what are the consequences of not notifying? Is that the question?
Yes, I think there were 2 parts. So one was, what is the root cause I'm guessing he's asking about the challenges or difficulties in reporting notifications. That's one. And I think Ibu Connie partly answered that portion. The second part was the consequences of not notifying the WTO. Okay,
that's a very good question. So I'm going to start with the final part of the question. The transparency is one of the principles of the World Trade Organization, right? So, and the EPing system that I included the link in the chat and I showed you, it's a system that only works if all the members contribute with the system, right? And notify their own regulations to make it available for the other members to comment on the regulation. So transparency is, I believe, It should be an interest in the interest of all WTO members, but it only functions well if all the members use the system and try to learn how to comment on each other's regulations. Of course, the e-ping is not the only tool. The other tool is for example, discussing other members' regulations or our own regulations in the TBT committee, the committees of the WTO that meet regularly. But the consequences, we could have, for example, a WTO dispute on this or a complaint on this. We could. Not notifying is not per se a violation of a WTO agreement, but combined it with other claims. For example, it could be a base of a problem at the WTO, right? So that's a consequence. That's a bad consequence. Of course, I'm talking about this in the final level, right, of consequences. But I think the message, transparency first, is one of the main principles of the organization. It only works with transparency of all the members to the extent, the larger extent as possible. Notifying and comment on each other's regulation, I think, is on the interest of every member, because at the end of the day, that it could affect trade flows, right? All the regulations that are notified in the e-ping system, for example, are the regulations that affect trade, only the ones that affect international trade. Not everything that you produce internally has to go to the e-ping system or to the WTO, but those that affect international trade. So I think my answer is mostly concerning the transparency is in the interest of everyone. It helps with our own domestic processes and helps with each other process, good regulatory practice, and we can think about, of course, regulatory cooperation and convergence at the end of the day as well of countries. With the less standards, less requirements, double requirements everywhere, it facilitates to everyone to trade, right? To trade goods. So the idea is to have one standard, one same requirement to the same product, and not have multiple standards, multiple requirements where they are not necessary. Mugant?
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Renata. So I have two more questions in the chat. One's related to local content and the other one's related to clinical trials permits. These are more related, I guess, or will be addressed in the next panel, so I don't want to raise it here. And maybe we can revisit these questions again later. Our panelists will be talking about similar or related issues. And I'm going to pause this panel right here because we are running a bit short on time, and we're going to move on to the next panel right now. So thank you very much, Renata. Thank you, Ibu Connie. Ibu Connie is actually at the airport right now delivering her presentation. So thank you very much. Really appreciate you doing this for us, and have a great trip. So we've got the next panel right now on global frameworks for regulation of medical devices. This session is focused on the international and regional guidance and frameworks to promote regulatory convergence and principles governing medical device regulations in Indonesia. Moderating the session, we have Jesus Reda Rodriguez, Director General Strategies, Special Projects and International Affairs at MedTech Europe, with panelists Agnes Kijo, a Technical Officer from the World Health Organization, Wang Weijiang, Assistant Group Director, Medical Devices Cluster, Health Product Regulation Group from Health Sciences Authority Singapore, and Pak Lupit Laksono, Head of Working Group, Directorate of Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Resiliency, Ministry of Health, Indonesia. Jesus, over to you, and I'll prompt you when it's time for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mugant. So welcome everyone to this session, and to this particular panel. First of all, thank you to the organizers and to everyone for the opportunity to be here. I'm Khusus Rueda. As has been introduced, I do act as the Director General of Strategies and International Affairs within MedTech Europe, and I also co-chair the Global Medical Technology Alliance, the GMTA, from which we work diligently towards trying to build up regulatory harmonization around the world. So it's very exciting for me to be here today with you all. As we are a little bit short of time, without further ado, I think that we can move on to Agnes, who has been working at the WHO to update and review the global regulatory framework for medical devices. So Agnes, please, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues. As introduced, my name is Agnes Sitakijo, and I'm going to take you through a presentation on good regulatory practices, but also to speak a little bit on some of the tools that are in place to support strengthening of regulatory systems. Thanks, Sandra. I can see my slides is already projected. Can we go to the second slide? So I will start with a bit of a background information on this popular slide to talk briefly about how WHO is contributing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially number 3 on good health, but more specifically target 3.8, which speaks to achieving universal health coverage, including financial risk protection, access to quality essential healthcare services, and access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable essential medicines and vaccines. So just
a moment, Agnes, we seem to have lost your sound for some reason. Is it just me, or is this a general problem?
I can hear Agnes, and I can hear Jesus as well.
Should I continue?
Yes, Agnes, we can hear you. Thank you.
That was great.
Okay, good. So I was talking about the Sustainable Development Goal target 3.8, which speaks about access to safe, effective, and quality, affordable medicines, of course, and other medical products. This Sustainable Development Goal is implemented through the 13th 5-year 2019-2023 WHO's global program of work with the 3 strategic priorities in it. And then the division of access to medicines and health products where I work has translated the 13th global program of work into a 5-year plan to help build effective and efficient regulatory system. So I will speak briefly on these important tools, and I've heard, I joined in the middle of the previous panel, and I could hear colleagues speaking about good regulatory practices. So this is very good. I don't need to emphasize too much. So I will speak briefly on some of the tools that have been developed by WHO to support NRAs in building effective and efficient regulatory systems. Next slide, please. So in this slide, next slide, please. So in these particular slides is just an outline on some of the tools that I'm going to briefly take you through. So one is the good regulatory practices principles, good reliance practices principles. All these documents have been published very recently, only last year, November. And then I'll speak a little bit on good regulatory system strengthening. It is not the area that I work with every day, but it is one of the team that we work together to support countries. But I would also speak also on the good global model regulatory framework for medical devices. And I hope I'll be able to keep time. So on the good regulatory practices, next slide, please, and next, please. So on the good regulatory practices, just briefly, I wanted to speak to the 67th World Health Assembly, which took place in May 2017, which spoke about the importance of a robust regulatory authority. And so member states endorsed a resolution 67.20 calling for WHO to support member states to have effective regulatory systems as an essential component of health system strengthening. So the resolution also recognized that regulators are essential part of health workforce, and that inefficient regulatory system can be a barrier to access to medical products, of course, including medical devices. And so this also reinforced the need to have this particular document developed. The document, the good regulatory practices, describes just high-level principles of what are the good regulatory practices, but also these principles serves as a benchmark to national regulatory authorities, which needs to be embedded within the other tools, which I'm also going to talk about on my next slides. And the scope for these good regulatory practices is, of course, relevant to regulators. I'm still on the other slide. I'm still on the previous slide. Yeah, so it is relevant to all regulators, irrespective of resources, irrespective of maturity or the model that the individual national regulatory authority has decided to approach, being regional or being national, but the good regulatory practices apply all across. Next slide, please. So these are the objectives. I'm not going to go through the objectives, so you can read this on your own because I'm trying to save time. Next slide, please. I will speak also briefly on the principles of the good regulatory practices. And I was happy also, is it Renata from the previous panel was speaking about the issue of transparency. So there are 9 high-level principles that are advocated to NRAs and which have been embedded within the other tools like the global benchmarking tool, the global model regulatory framework, and all these documents form part of the assessment of the NRA through the specific sub-indicators which are specified in the GPT. And so some of these principles, or these 9 principles, are legality. That means the national framework should provide the necessary authority, scope, and flexibility to safeguard and promote health. So all the regulatory authority need to be backed up by a legal framework. Issues around delegation of power, clarity on the roles and responsibilities at various levels of regulatory system. I'm coming from a low middle income country, and I have been experiencing a lot of overlapping, a lot of confusion in terms of who is regulating what. So important to have a very clear a legal framework or regulatory framework that speaks to scope and mandate to regulate these products. Issue around consistency. Regulations should be clear and predictable and should be implemented and enforced consistently to all the medical product sector. Issues around independence. So we expect that the regulatory system to operate and be seen to operate in an independent and authoritative manner. Issues around impartiality, expectations that the legal framework or legal system should be impartial in order to be fair to everybody, and of course avoid as much as possible conflict of interest. Proportionality. This speaks to issues around the risk, in that the national regulatory system should not exceed what is necessary to achieve the objective. And so issues around risk assessment is important. Flexibility, clarity, I think these are terms that are self-explanatory. Efficiency, and of course, transparency. So the expectation is that the regulatory system should be transparent. Requirements and decisions should be made known to affected parties and where appropriate to the public in general. And I think one of the issues that we have emphasized recently during the discussions of the revision of the Global Model Regulatory Framework is really to, and we have added actually a completely new chapter that speaks to stakeholders' engagement. And this is because we wanted to address more this particular principle that when you're coming up with new regulations, then stakeholders need to be engaged from the beginning. And of course, the clarity in terms of the requirement, and of course, transparency in terms of how the decisions are going to be made. Next slide, please. In this particular slide, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because it's a very important slide, but it speaks to the enablers. So what are the foundational issues, or what are the issues that could affect implementation of good regulatory practices? Or if I can maybe put it that in a different way, what are the enablers, what are the issues that could support implementation of good regulatory practices? I look at, for example, issues around political and government support. So in order to be able to practice good regulatory elements, you need to have a sustained support at the highest political and government level, including policy makers. So this is very essential for the proper implementation of the concepts and principles of GRP. So they are listed, so you can actually read this on your own afterwards, but they are very important and need to be observed when introducing good regulatory practices within the regulatory framework. Next slide. So I will also speak about good reliance practices concept. So good reliance practices concept also originate from the good regulatory practices. And the principles of reliance, or maybe if I can speak briefly on what reliance is. So reliance is the act where a national regulatory authority in one country takes into account or gives significant weight of work or assessment or any activity that is done by another regulatory authority or trusted institution such as WHO, or to any other authoritative information in reaching its own decisions. And there are various forms of reliance approaches. I will speak about in the last, I think, slides on reliance. But the idea behind the concept of principles of reliance is really to foster international cooperation, to ensure that products are safe. And we also understand that, the reality is no regulatory authority, even the best resourced ones, that can do the regulatory work alone. And I always give examples of US FDA that is engaging in the MDSAP project, Medical Devices Single Audit Program. And so one may ask questions, why would the US FDA go into such systems? So this is a proof that no regulatory authority, regardless of the resources, can be able to effectively conduct all the regulatory work without relying to the others. But I think the good part of the reliance practices is that the relying authority remains independent in terms of the final decision. So as much as you may be relying or taking a significant weight to some of the assessment of the work that has been done by another regulatory authority, but final decision is by the regulatory authority. Next slide, please. So this slide also, I'm going to skip this one. It just provides some kind of an examples of some of the different approaches in conformity assessment that national regulatory authority may opt to adapt. Some may adapt to conduct all the regulatory work on their own. Of course, it's burdensome, cumbersome, but then you may decide also to rely or to recognize other activities or outcome from the other regulatory authorities, and that reduces the workload from the national regulatory authorities. Next slide, please. So the key concepts, again, these are very straightforward kind of concepts. So it speaks about the issue of recognition. So this is when national regulatory authority decides to take account of the final decision that has been made by another national regulatory authority. It can be unilateral, it can be mutual. So one may decide to, both the national regulatory authority may decide to recognize decision from each other, or some may decide to only take account the decision of only one national regulatory authority without any reciprocity. And so these are some of the approaches that can be used with reliance. It is a life cycle approach, so it can be applied all across the full cycle of a medical product. Risk-based approach, of course, is applied, and also regional reliance mechanisms can also be adopted. Next slide, please. These are just general consideration. I think I want to speak only to one, but it is very important when you're relying that sameness of the product is verified. And so then this is one of the main consideration that I wanted to come out very clear, that as much as you may want to rely on somebody else's outcome, and especially as far as market authorization activities are concerned, it is important to determine that the product that or the reports that you're relying on are of the same product. So this is very, very important that I thought I should emphasize. The next slide speaks about how do you determine then the sameness of a product of a medical device. Please go to the next slide. Yeah, so it speaks about how could one determine the sameness of a product. I will not go through this, you can read this on your own, but you can see some of the elements, and these are very well described at length in the collaborative registration procedure for in vitro diagnostics. It really describes how could one verify sameness of a product, but we also expect to come up with another document that would guide further national regulatory authorities on how to determine sameness of products before embarking into reliance. Next slide, please. So some of the examples of the reliance, I've spoken about the medical devices single audit program. I understand this is a very popular program, but we also have the WHO collaborative registration procedure for in vitro diagnostics. It's quite new, it started in 2019. I hope I'll be able to get some other time to speak to you about the collaborative registration procedure, but also there is a newly introduced WHO EUL facilitated procedure for COVID assays. This was introduced during the pandemic to support or to facilitate authorization of products. And then there is the Thai FDA Singapore HA Regulatory Alliance. I know my colleague Wei Juan is in attendance here, maybe she'll speak to that, but these are all good examples of reliance in the medical devices field. Next slide, please. So the next slide is about the WHO regulatory system strengthening. I think I will just have to move a little bit fast. If you can go to the next slide. Next. So I want to speak a little bit about the WHO benchmarking of national regulatory authorities. So this is one of the very important tools that is used to evaluate national regulatory systems, just to determine what is the maturity of the national regulatory authority. So recently, the GBT, which was only covering pharmaceuticals and vaccines and blood products, has been expanded to also include sub-indicators to assess medical devices systems, regulatory systems. And so this tool is available. I'm not too sure if I have shared the link to the recently published devices. I know I have shared a link here, but this is a link to the revision 6, which covers the other medical products. But I will share with you the link that also speaks to medical devices. It's a very important tool because it sort of assesses or identifies what are the strengths and what are the areas of improvement in a very systematic way. And also it provides a way to prioritize the interventions and also help to monitor progress and achievement, of course, with collaboration, in close collaboration with WHO. So I really urge colleagues to look into this document and, of course, reach out to WHO for this assessment. There is a pilot that is ongoing at the moment. We expect to have the first pilot for the GBT plus medical devices in Kenya in June. And we might also go to Cuba to pilot, but this will have to be confirmed. I'll quickly go to the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework. On the next slide, please. Next. Yes, so go to the next slide. Yeah. So I will speak briefly about the current work that we are doing on the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework. I trust that Indonesia is familiar with the Global Model Regulatory Framework. This is a document that was published by WHO in 2017, relevant to all member states. It describes the responsibilities of a country NRA for implementing and enforcing regulation. So within the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework, the principles of good regulatory practice are embedded within this particular document. And this document actually was used during drafting or during development of the sub-indicators in the GBT. So you can see a lot of similarities in terms of how these documents complement each other. So there is a current revision that is going on, and I understand some of you might have participated in the discussion of the working group. I know for sure Wu Juan was actively and consistently participating in the discussion. So we realized that there has been a lot of changes in the medical devices field because the document was published in 2017, so it was being utilized for about maybe about 6 years maybe, and so we decided to update so that, you know, to catch up with the rapidly changing technologies in the area of medical devices. We have issues such as, you know, artificial intelligence, software as medical devices, and so many other technologies that are coming up. So we wanted the document to be as updated as possible. And of course, there are several guidance documents that were recently published. Last year, WHO published the post-market surveillance and market surveillance guidance, good reliance practices, good regulatory practices, and of course, the discussion during the integration of the sub-indicators into the global benchmarking tool. This also triggered a review of the global model regulatory framework, but also the experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, which clearly demonstrated that the importance of reliable and appropriate regulatory systems for medical devices, and of course, appropriate quality medical devices and IVDs. The experience also of using the global model regulatory framework teaches that countries will benefit expansively for a more detailed guidance on the topic. And so what we have done, next slide, please. We have expanded some of the topics, next slide. So we have expanded some of the topics, and we have included completely new chapters into this document. It has gone recently in the first round of public consultation, and I hope colleagues, you have been able to go through and provided your comments. So we have received about 683 comments during the first round of public consultation. We will be conducting regional consultative meeting on the 15th with PAO and 23rd with the rest of the regions. And the document will again go for the second round of public consultation between July and August. So newly introduced topics in the revised global model regulatory framework is the topic on regulatory pathways. So this is a new topic that describes issues around emergency authorization, what would be the appropriate way to manage approval of products during emergency, regulatory pathway on conformity assessment when you're using reliance or when you're using a normal pathway. We have included new chapters on stakeholders engagement, capacity building elements, etc. So it's a very good document. We've added a lot of diagrams and a lot of flowcharts to really guide national regulatory authorities on how to approach some of the elements in the regulation of medical devices and IVDs. So I will stop here, and I hope, I don't know if I've been, I've managed the time well, but this is what I wanted to share with you, and I'll be happy to be asked any question around what I have just presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Agnes. I think that in the interest of time, we'll let the other speakers present, and then we'll take all the questions at the end if we have a little time left. So I do have to emphasize that we are a little bit behind schedule. So without further ado, I pass the meeting over to Wengwei Yuang. Thank you so much for being here with us. And please, as an IMDRF member and leading authority in ASEAN, tell us how things are going in Singapore.
Thank you. I first of all like to thank, can you all hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, very much. I first of all like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this panel. I'm very glad to be able to share some of Singapore's policy on regulating medical devices and what Singapore has done in terms of convergence efforts and the bilateral reliance model that we have with Thai FDA that Agnes talked about. I'm cognizant that I have about 5 to 8 minutes to speak. I don't have any slides, but I'll just go through verbally on what we have done so far. So for Singapore, we have started our regulatory controls for medical device way back in 2010. And way before that, we actually studied the regulatory framework for the 5 founding members of GHTF, namely Australia, EU, Health Canada, Japan, and US FDA. And after studying them, we also adopted quite a lot of the principles from GHTF, and we then decided to call these 5 founding members as our reference agencies, meaning that once the medical device is registered in any of these 5 reference agencies, they can come in for approval or for evaluation in Singapore, and they will enjoy a shorter timeline, lower cost, and lesser dossier requirements. So that was a decision that we made. We call it the abridged evaluation route, and that was a decision we made right at the beginning to help facilitate and also to manage our regulatory workload, recognizing the limited resources that we have. So that was the first reliance work that we leveraged on the founding members of GHTF. Then we, on a regional basis, we also as a member of ASEAN, we also participated in the ASEAN Medical Device Directive, AMDC, which requires all 10 ASEAN members to use something called the ASEAN CSDT, Common Submission Dossier Template. And this Common Submission Dossier Template outlines the requirements for the regulatory outlines the regulatory requirements for medical device approval. And so it aligns all the requirements for all 10 ASEAN countries. And the purpose is that once a company develop the dossier for one country in ASEAN, they can actually submit the same dossier to all the other 9 ASEAN countries. So it actually reduces the cost for the company in terms of regulatory cost. And at the same time, for this ASEAN Medical Device Directive, we also harmonize the classification of medical devices. We know that prior to AMDC, a lot of the countries in ASEAN do regulate some medical device that is as drugs, and it was not a very aligned across the 10 ASEAN countries. So under the AMDD, the classification of medical medical device. The definition was agreed upon with all 10 ASEAN countries, and the classification, we have 4-tiered risk-based classification A, B, C, D, which is more or less aligned with the EU classification of 1, 2A, 2B, and C. So that helps all 10 ASEAN countries to have alignment in the classification. So besides classification, common submission, dossier template, of course, post-market framework was also aligned for all 10 ASEAN country members, in that manufacturers are required to keep distribution complaint records and for reporting of adverse events. Yeah, so that is something that we work with in ASEAN with all 10 ASEAN member countries. And then on further with Thailand, we had deep discussion with Thailand, and there was this we were decided to work towards a regulatory reliance model because Thailand was a few years back. Thailand was gearing themselves to adopt the AMDC, and they want to see how best they can do to regulate the medical devices according to AMDC with the resources that they have. So we had discussion sessions with Thai FDA. We went through in detail how HSA regulate and evaluate the medical devices for all the different classes and all the different routes that we have. There was and Thai FDA was comfortable in how we regulate. There was lots of exchange of information, and eventually Thai FDA decided that they did 2 pilot rounds, and with the companies submitting the dossier. And what happens is that we did it for the high risk first, for class D, where the company submit the dossier to Thai FDA, and if the product is already registered in Singapore HSA, we share the evaluation report with Thai FDA. And so with the evaluation report, Thai FDA is able to reduce their evaluation time substantially. So that helps in the approval timeline for Thai FDA. So Thailand officially, after the pilot program, Thailand officially announced that they would go with this reliance pathway with HSA for Class D. And quite recently, Thai FDA have also informed the industry that they will also proceed with the reliance for Class B and C. However, for Class B and C, as many more devices are in Class B and C, so the agreement was that so long as the product is registered in and already on our database, Singapore has Singapore Medical Device Register, SMDR, which all registered products are reflected on SMDR. So Thai FDA would refer to this register to confirm that the product is registered in Singapore to proceed with their reliance part. So for B and C, we may not need to share our evaluation report with Thai FDA, but and they will just refer to SMDR. But if they have any query, they want to find out more, they are free to reach out to HSA to check on the evaluation that we have done for the Class B and C. So that is very briefly what we have done with Thai FDA on the reliance program. And on the international front, as you know, Singapore is with a member of IMDRF, and we are very active in the GRP working group that we co-chair with USA on the GRP working group to work towards eventually regulatory reliance program for review. It's work in progress, but we hope to work towards a good review process for for medical devices, something similar to MDSEP but for review of medical devices. For MDSEP, we are very supportive of MDSEP. We are affiliate member of MDSEP. We joined much later after the MDSEP have already grouped and formed a team. So we were not able to join the main group of MDSEP, but we are working towards it. However, we do accept MDSEP certificates for our regulatory approval. So on the front of international and region, we are actually very participative in Reliance work, and we work towards any such program that is benefit to both the regulators and the industry. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Wei. And it's very inspiring to see these examples of Reliance actually working in the field. It's something that is very encouraging for the future of regulations around the world. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Laksono, and I hope I haven't messed that name up too much. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay. Very good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jesus, for the introduction. I would like to say thank you to all of you who joined in this webinar, and we also delighted that we have a good cooperation with the USAID and MDRC teams, so we can have today's webinar. Because most of the audience is Indonesian with bahasa, I think I better use bahasa Indonesia. Thank you. Baik Bapak Ibu sekalian, saya izin sedikit menyampaikan satu slide, beberapa slide ini. Baik Bapak Ibu sekalian, sedikit saja saya ada beberapa slide yang akan saya sampaikan. Terutama saya ingin menyampaikan bahwa Indonesia khususnya di Kementerian Kesehatan sudah memiliki sistem transformasi kesehatan yang 2021-2024 yang direncanakan. Dan di sini Bapak Ibu sekalian, visinya adalah ada 6 pilar yang akan dikawal, yaitu dari primary service transformation, secondary service, kemudian yang saya highlight adalah healthy security system transformation, khususnya peningkatan resiliensi farmasi dan alat kesehatan ya Bapak Ibu sekalian. Kemudian ada healthcare financing transformation, healthcare worker transformation, and digital technology transformation. Jadi pilar inilah yang mendasari untuk kegiatan maupun strategi di Kementerian Kesehatan selama 2021 sampai 2024. Nah, alat kesehatan merupakan salah satu sektor yang sangat penting, termasuk farma juga, untuk dapat dikembangkan khususnya untuk kemandiriannya. Jadi Bapak Ibu sekalian, kita belajar dari pandemi COVID yang sudah hampir 2 tahun lebih ini, dan saat ini juga belum berakhir. Pada intinya memang Indonesia ingin mengembangkan produk-produk alat kesehatan dalam negerinya agar lebih banyak istilahnya mampu menangani permasalahan kesehatan yang ada di Indonesia. Kita di Indonesia masih banyak penyakit menular, penyakit tidak menular, dan kemudian ada emerging disease juga yang masuk Indonesia. Nah, hal itulah yang ingin dimaksimalkan bagaimana farmasi maupun alat kesehatan dapat menjawab tantangan tersebut. Kemudian terkait dengan topik pada hari ini, memang terkait dengan yang sesi di saat ini, di mana memang disampaikan bahwa Indonesia bagaimana regulatori alat kesehatannya. Sebenarnya Indonesia seperti disampaikan oleh tadi Miss Weijen about the medical device regulation in ASEAN, sebenarnya kita mengadopsi hal yang sama dan sudah diimplementasikan di peraturan menteri yang ada di Indonesia. Nah, salah satu yang paling penting adalah tentang Omnibus Law, kemudian ada Government Regulation Number 5 tahun 2021, kemudian ada Permenkes nomor 14 dan Permenkes nomor 62. Dan pada intinya semua alat kesehatan yang beredar di Indonesia atau masuk ke Indonesia dan diproduksi di Indonesia harus memiliki izin edar sebagai bentuk jaminan dari pemerintah terhadap keamanan mutu dan manfaat dari alat kesehatan ya Bapak Ibu sekalian. Kemudian mengenai Indonesian pre and post market control of medical device, sesuai yang disampaikan oleh Ms. Kijo bahwa kita semuanya menganut pada WHO regulatory framework yang dibuat di tahun 2017. Pada tahun 2017 sudah ada working group dan Indonesia salah satu kontributor terhadap pembuatan standar WHO Global Regulatory Framework, menjadi acuan bagi seluruh negara untuk mengadopsi bagaimana mengadopsi regulasi alat kesehatan dan IVD di dalamnya. Pada intinya di sini adalah daur hidup dari alat kesehatan yang mulai dari product research, production, registration atau izin edar, kemudian pengiklanan, distribusi sampai dengan consumer dan disposal. Nah, semua dari pre dan post market Indonesia sudah mempunyai sistem regulasi yang jelas dan menganut pada global practices, yaitu di situ dari sisi pre market mulai dari manufakturnya itu dilakukan manufacture license atau GMP atau di Indonesia kan namanya CPAKB. Kemudian di produknya sendiri harus diberikan license melalui evaluasi izin edar, termasuk juga distributornya atau yang melakukan distribusi harus mempunyai namanya Good Distribution Practice atau CDAKB. Itu dari sisi pre-market. Dan kemudian dari sisi post-market juga dikawal. Tadi juga ada beberapa pertanyaan terkait dengan post-market seperti apa. Post-market ini setelah produk beredar itu juga diawasi melalui sampling and testing. Kemudian ada kendali untuk periklanan, inspeksi ke lapangan terbaik untuk produk alkes, post border monitoring, audit dan vigilance. Jadi produk yang sudah beredar itu secara rutin dilakukan audit dan dilakukan inspeksi dan penindakan apabila ditemukan produk-produk yang nanti ada adverse event. Nah, kalau ada adverse event itu termasuk yang produk-produk yang akan dilakukan corrective action and preventive action. Jadi di Kementerian Kesehatan regulasi alkes sudah established. Dari sisi pre-market ada Direktorat Produksi dan Distribusi Alkes, dan untuk post-market ada Direktorat Pengawasan Alat Kesehatan. Dan ditambah lagi satu, terkait dengan resiliensi, kita sudah ada Direktorat Khusus yang menangani ketahanan, kefarmasian, dan alat kesehatan untuk mengembangkan produk-produk dalam negeri dan juga policy-nya, seperti itu. Nah, Bapak Ibu sekalian, di sini kita lihat bahwa Indonesia sudah menganut meratifikasi ASEAN Medical Device Directive pada tahun 2018 sudah diratifikasi dan diimplementasikan melalui Permenkes 62 Bapak Ibu sekalian. Jadi alkes yang paling penting adalah memang alkes itu mempunyai kelas risiko. Ada A, B, C, dan D, dari yang rendah sampai yang tinggi, dari produk yang sederhana, menengah sampai produk yang high end atau yang sophisticated, ya. Kelas risiko ini berdasarkan potensi dari risiko yang akan ditimbulkan atau memberikan harm kepada penggunanya. Nah, kemudian terkait dengan sistem regulasi Indonesia untuk medical device, yang menjadi utama adalah memang kita, karena kita 10 negara ASEAN menganut ASEAN Medical Device Directive. Kami bekerja sama selama dalam 1 tahun kami ada meeting 2 kali. Kemudian di sini mengatur terkait dengan sisi pre-market, post-market, standar, clinical performance and safety, and quality management system. Nah, di sini juga kami bersama-sama selain dengan ASEAN Medical Device Directive, kami bekerja sama dengan Global Harmonization Working Party yang beranggotakan negara Asia. Kemudian juga kami kerjasama aktif juga di WHO, itu ada namanya SEARN, ya, Southeast Asia Regulatory Network. Kita juga salah satu working group-nya. Kemudian di APEC, APEC namanya Regulatory Harmonisasi Working Committee, itu di situ juga membahas terkait produk working area-nya adalah medical device, ya. Di luar itu juga kita ada kerjasama bilateral. Nah, bisa dilihat di sini bahwa memang sama seperti yang WHO Global Regulatory Framework, mereka membagi kelas juga menjadi A, B, C, dan D. Dan di sini setiap kelas ini punya istilahnya resiko masing-masing dan bagaimana cara melakukan mitigasinya juga ada di dalam guideline AMDD maupun di WHO tersebut. Ya, ini jadi Bapak Ibu sekalian, memang terkait dengan regulatory sistem alat kesehatan, kami khususnya di ASEAN member countries itu istilahnya punya meeting ASEAN Medical Device Technical Meeting yang membahas masalah teknis. Nah, itu kami bekerja sama juga sejak tahun 2017 sampai 2021. Indonesia menjadi chair dari ASEAN Medical Device Technical Committee bersama dengan Singapura. Dan saat ini sudah Indonesia step down dan kemudian Singapura naik menjadi chairnya. Di situ kami membahas terkait dengan borderline of product medical device, juga risiko, klasifikasi risiko dari setiap negara, ada 10 negara. Jadi kami berusaha untuk mengharmonisasikan kelas risiko alat kesehatan yang ada di Indonesia maupun di ASEAN. Jadi apabila produk alat kesehatan masuk ke wilayah Indonesia atau di ASEAN itu mempunyai platform yang sama, yaitu kelas risiko yang sama, sehingga tidak ada perbedaan dalam meregulasinya. Karena memang ASEAN Medical Device Directive hanya memberikan direktif arahan terkait dengan rule of classification, tapi memang setiap negara punya perspektif sendiri. Nah, itulah yang menjadi tantangan yang harus kami bukan seragamkan ya, kami harmonisasi atau konvergensikan terkait dengan kelas risiko alat kesehatan. Itu di tingkat ASEAN, Bapak Ibu sekalian. Lepas dari itu semua dengan semakin meningkatnya kesadaran, kemudian setiap negara mempunyai sistem regulasi yang jelas, kemudian ada beberapa negara, khususnya negara-negara GHTF atau Global Harmonization yang Task Force atau yang sekarang negara MDRF, itu mempunyai regulasi yang stringent. Makanya konsep reliance antar negara ini sangat diharapkan. Nah, untuk mendukung reliance, Indonesia juga sebenarnya sudah mengadopsi bagaimana apabila suatu produk yang sudah ada di negara-negara GHTF itu sudah memenuhi persyaratannya, deklarasinya, itu biasanya kita akan memberikan kemudahan dalam pemberian izin edar, dalam arti waktu layanan tidak akan terlalu lama, karena mereka sudah mempunyai dokumentasi yang baik. Nah, kemudian untuk produk alat kesehatan yang sederhana atau yang kelas A, beberapa produk sudah kita lakukan notifikasi untuk mempercepat agar produk-produk yang berisiko rendah itu dapat langsung dipasarkan di wilayah Indonesia, karena memang risikonya rendah dan di beberapa negara sudah dinotifikasi juga. Jadi kita mengadopsi sistem regulasi yang ada di internasional. Seperti itu. Pada prinsipnya waktu layanan di medical device di Indonesia itu sudah cukup yang paling baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, sesuai dengan kelas risikonya ya. Dan kami harapkan kemudian ini beberapa hari yang waktu lalu kami juga dihubungi oleh MDA Malaysia untuk mereka untuk bekerja sama, bagaimana kita bisa bekerja sama untuk reliance. Mungkin nanti dengan Singapura mungkin kita akan juga approach juga karena kami sesama negara ASEAN itu punya bonding yang lebih kuat, Bapak Ibu sekalian, terutama untuk sharing dari regulatory practices atau framework yang ada di ASEAN. Thank you, Jesus. I think that's all my explanation about the Indonesia regulation right now. So I would be happy if we have a discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Jesus. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lupi. It's been very enlightening to see how things have been developing in Malaysia as well, in Indonesia as well. At this stage, I think that we are running a little bit over time already. So even though I'm sure that there's a lot of questions from the audience interested in how things are going, I would like to thank all of the speakers of the session for their contributions. It really shows how going forward, this is an international effort that can have an impact from the global level all the way down to a concrete national level on how the concepts of reliance and regulatory compliance are actually implemented. And I think that I would pass the meeting back to Mugant for the final remarks for the day.
All right, thank you very much, Jesus, Agnes, Wei Chuang, and Pak Lupi for navigating us through that huge topic. Jesus and Agnes, particularly appreciate you being up really early in the morning to share your expertise. I believe Agnes has 3 more major events today, so it is going to be a very long day. So thank you again very, very much. We are now nearing the end of the webinar. We heard about GRPs and what they constitute, how the WTO-TBT agreement that is binding on all members advocates and promotes GRPs, the role of the ASN, perspectives on international guidance and frameworks on medical devices, and Indonesia and Singapore's experiences in regulating medical devices. I hope the webinar was useful to everyone. The second part of the webinar on good regulatory practices in Indonesia and stakeholder perspectives is scheduled next week on 22nd June, Jakarta. The webinar will discuss quality management systems, processes and standards for medical devices, and post-market surveillance issues with a focus on Indonesia. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day. And to those in the Western Hemisphere, have a good rest. See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mugant. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.